Tariffs are a term you've been probably hearing a lot recently, especially because Donald Trump is back in the White House, and they are one of his signature policies, and even his favorite word.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
This time, he plans to go even further than the last, as he's planning to raise tariffs on everything from foreign steel to foreign foods, cars, chips, and electronics, and much, much more. All under the banner of putting America first. But it hasn't been without controversy. Trump's critics claim that the American consumer will end up paying the price, while his supporters say that the tariffs will bring back jobs to the states, benefiting Americans in the end. But how does it really work? What exactly are tariffs? And what kind of impact do they really have? For centuries, like today, tariffs have been used to protect local industries, boost government revenue, and sometimes as a political tool in global trade disputes. Some say they're essential for protecting jobs and strengthening the economy. Others argue they come with unintended consequences that can end up costing consumers. With new tariffs on the horizon in the US, let's break down how tariffs work, what incentives they create, and why they're such a controversial tool in economic policy. And by looking at historical examples, we might just get a clearer picture of what lies ahead. Let's start with the basics. What exactly are tariffs? A tariff is essentially a tax on imported goods. When a country places a tariff on an item, say steel, it means that any steel coming in from another country gets hit with an extra cost. And what is the goal? To make imported goods more expensive so that locally made products look more affordable by comparison. There are a few main reasons why countries use tariffs. First, there's protecting domestic industries. By making foreign goods pricier, tariffs can encourage people to buy homegrown products, which can help keep jobs and money within the country. This is one of the arguments Trump and his supporters make. By raising tariffs, they hope to protect American manufacturing and bring back jobs that have gone overseas. Then there's raising government revenue. A tariff generates income for the government each time a taxed item crosses the border, which can be a useful source of revenue. But not everyone's sold on tariffs. Critics argue that tariffs end up raising prices for consumers because companies often pass that extra cost down to the buyer. So, while tariffs may help domestic industries, they can also mean higher prices for everyday products. Trump's critics argue that this is the real cost of tariffs, more expensive goods, not just for luxury items, but also for things like food, cars, and electronics. To bring this closer to home, let's imagine a toaster as our example, a stand in for all consumer goods that might be affected by tariffs. Let's say that the United States and China are both producing toasters. The US toaster costs $55 in an American store, and the Chinese toaster costs $50 in the same store. If these toasters are of the same quality, which we will assume they are for the sake of simplicity, an American consumer will always choose to buy the Chinese toaster because it is $5 cheaper to buy. China has a lower cost of labor, and so it is able to manufacture these toasters cheaper than the United States is. And now, since the American company cannot sell its toasters anymore because of the Chinese competition, it is under threat of going bankrupt. If it does, all the American workers in the toaster company will lose their jobs, which will have a cascading economic effect that isn't great for the US. An American politician like Donald Trump might see this and think, we really need to do something about this. How about we tax these Chinese goods at higher prices so that the American companies don't go out of business? And that's essentially how tariffs work. A politician like Trump then goes in and passes a hypothetical 50% tariff on Chinese toasters. Now, when entering the US, the Chinese toasters are taxed an additional $25, ramping up their price in stores to $75. And now, when an American wants to buy a toaster, they will always buy the American toaster at $55 as opposed to a Chinese toaster at $75. American jobs are protected. Well done, right? Well, not so fast. It's not that simple. And some of you might have noticed this already, but let's take a look at the prices of toasters before and after our hypothetical tariffs were put in place. The cheapest toaster an American could buy before was $50, and now it is $55. And if the American wants the specific Chinese toaster, then they need to fork over an additional $25 more than they would have to before. This is the first problem with tariffs, and that is that they inevitably cause prices to rise, and the price rises are not only limited to the foreign goods that are subject to tariffs, but also to domestic goods. To understand this better, let's go back to our example. Now that the Chinese toasters are forced to be sold at $75, the government has effectively disrupted the natural process of price allocation of goods and artificially raised the price of Chinese toasters. This causes the demand for Chinese toasters to fall, and all that extra demand for people who wanted to buy Chinese toasters is now transferred to the American made toasters. Suddenly, the American toasters are selling out while nobody is buying the Chinese toasters. And the American company decides to raise its price to fully capture all of the demand that they can. They might choose to raise their price to $60, $65, or even $70. And since the American consumers no longer have a cheaper alternative in Chinese toasters, they will still buy just as many toasters as before, just at a higher price. This is how tariffs can cause the prices of even domestic made goods to rise. Now, that isn't too different from regular taxes, as other tax types, such as the VAT, also raise prices of goods to the same effect. But there are some additional catches when it comes to tariffs, notably how other countries will react to them. Most of the time, a country won't just sit there and let you place tariffs on goods that it produces. Most of the time, they will fight back in kind, and when a country does that, those are called retaliatory tariffs. Imagine the US has just slapped that 50% tariff on Chinese toasters. Now, China might not just sit back and watch their toaster sales suffer. They will probably respond by placing tariffs on American goods going into China. Suddenly, American companies trying to sell their products in China are facing their own hurdles with higher prices, just like those Chinese toaster manufacturers in the US. This back and forth is what's called a trade war. One country raises tariffs, the other responds in kind, and before long, you've got tariffs flying back and forth like an economic tennis match. In the end, businesses and consumers on both sides end up paying more, and the initial goal, whether protecting jobs or boosting local industry, can get lost in a cycle of retaliation. To see this in action, let's look back at a real historical example of tariffs sparking a full blown trade conflict. One of the most infamous examples of tariffs in the United States history were the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs of 1930. This wasn't just any tariff. It's often remembered as the tariff that helped tip the world deeper into the Great Depression. The story begins in the aftermath of the 1929 stock market crash. As the Great Depression was settling in, people across America were losing their jobs, and businesses were closing left and right. The economic collapse hit industries hard, especially agriculture, which was already suffering from low prices due to overproduction. Politicians naturally wanted some way to respond to their constituents' pain that would also be publicly popular, and so they looked to protect American jobs and industries from what they saw as unfair foreign competition. Enter Senators Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley, who were at the front of a push for a new tariff bill. Their reasoning was simple. If the government raised tariffs on imported goods, it would make those foreign products more expensive in the United States, leading American consumers to buy more domestically produced goods. In theory, this would boost American industries, keep American factories running, and most importantly, protect American jobs. At a time that is known as the Great Depression, it's easy to see why this policy seemed so appealing. But Smoot and Hawley didn't stop at a modest tariff increase. Their bill raised tariffs to historically high levels, imposing an average duty of nearly 60% on over 20,000 imported goods. To put it into perspective, tariffs have been high before in the US, but Smoot-Hawley took things to a whole new level. And it wasn't just targeted tariffs on specific goods, it was a blanket increase across a massive range of products. This was protectionism turned up to the max. Of course, not everyone was on board. Critics of Smoot-Hawley warned that such extreme tariffs could backfire. Economists, business leaders, and even some politicians argued that raising tariffs on foreign goods could provoke other countries to retaliate, slapping tariffs on American products in return. They warned that a trade war could unfold, which would actually reduce demand for American exports and hurt U.S. industries, especially agriculture, even more. Over 1,000 economists signed an open letter urging President Herbert Hoover to veto the bill, arguing that the tariffs would deepen the economic crisis rather than alleviate it. But Smoot-Hawley's promise of American first protectionism resonated with many Americans who were looking for any solution to the rising unemployment and economic pain. And despite the warnings, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was signed into law by President Herbert Hoover in June of 1930. And what were the results? Just as the critics had predicted, other countries didn't just sit idly by. They responded with tariffs of their own, making it much harder for American exporters to sell their goods abroad. Canada, which had been one of America's biggest trading partners, hit back with tariffs on U.S. exports like eggs, meats, and dairy, causing American farmers to lose a critical market. France, Germany, Britain, and other nations followed suit, raising their own trade barriers against U.S. goods. American exports plummeted by nearly 60% within 2 years, from around $5.2 billion in 1929 to $1.7 billion in 1932. And the price of some goods rose significantly as import options dwindled, adding strain to American households already struggling with the Depression. As a result, not only were American industries not doing well because they could no longer make money abroad and were basically locked into the domestic market, but goods in general were much more expensive domestically for American consumers, which worsened the Great Depression even more. By the time the dust settled, Smoot-Hawley had become a textbook example of how tariffs, when taken to extremes, can end up hurting the very people they're supposed to protect. Let's travel back even further to Britain in the early 1800s, where another infamous tariff policy was in play: the Corn Laws. These tariffs weren't about corn as we think of it today. Corn was a term for grains, especially wheat, and the Corn Laws were all about keeping the price of British wheat high, no matter the cost to the consumer. The story states that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain had been at war for over 20 years, and throughout the conflict, foreign trade had been unreliable at best. Because of the blockade against Europe, Britain's domestic agriculture was essential, and prices for British grown wheat soared. But once peace returned, so did foreign trade. And suddenly, cheaper mainland European wheat was becoming stiff competition to domestic British wheat. To the British aristocracy, this was a massive threat. Britain was a society dominated by the wealthy landowning class who owned huge estates and farmland. Many of them relied on high prices for British grown wheat to maintain their profits. Cheaper foreign grain flooding in would slash those prices and, in their view, harm British agriculture. They argued that if British farmers couldn't compete with cheap imports, farmland would be abandoned, jobs lost, and Britain would become dangerously reliant on foreign food suppliers. It was basically the same argument as protecting industry is in the modern day, except for agriculture. Anyways, the Parliament stepped in with what they saw as a solution: the Corn Laws of 1815. These laws established a tariff on imported grain that was only lifted if domestic prices hit an extreme high level, 80 shillings per quarter, a unit of about 217 kilograms of wheat. In practical terms, this meant that foreign grain was essentially banned unless British wheat prices reached that high threshold, ensuring that British farmers always had a market. Supporters of the Corn Laws saw this as a way to protect British jobs, preserve the countryside, and keep Britain self sufficient in food production. They argued that relying on foreign grain was dangerous, as it made the country vulnerable to political conflicts and economic instability abroad. The Corn Laws, they believed, were a matter of national security as much as economic policy. But opponents saw things very differently. They argued that the Corn Laws were simply a way for wealthy landowners to keep themselves rich at the expense of everyone else. For the average working family, the Corn Laws meant higher food prices, as wheat and bread were essential staples. As a result, the Corn Laws kept food unaffordable, causing real hardship for the poor and working class. Industrialists and urban workers alike resented the high cost of living these tariffs created, and calls for repeal of the Corn Laws grew louder, especially as the Industrial Revolution began drawing more people into cities where food costs had an even greater impact on wages and living standards. So, what actually happened? In the years that followed, the Corn Laws became one of the most controversial policies in British history. On the one hand, they did succeed in their goal of keeping domestic wheat prices high, which protected landowners' profits. But on the other hand, this protectionism hit ordinary people hard. Bread was a basic necessity, and the artificially high prices on wheat drove up the cost of food for nearly everyone. It created a stark economic divide, with the wealthy aristocrats profiting while industrial workers and the poor faced rising hunger and financial strain. The Corn Laws didn't just harm individual households, they stifled economic growth too. With high food prices, industrial employers were pressured to raise wages to help workers afford their basic needs, which made it harder to expand manufacturing and invest in industry. Britain's economy was caught in a bind: protect the agricultural aristocrats or encourage the rising industrial economy. Where the free market conditions would have allocated scarce resources in the most efficient way, the Corn Laws were attempting to force the will of the aristocrats upon everyone, hurting the British economy in the process. Eventually, the public backlash grew overwhelming. In 1846, the government finally repealed the Corn Laws, led by Prime Minister Robert Peel, who made the politically risky decision to side with free trade advocates over the powerful landowners. The repeal opened Britain up to cheap imports once again, lowering food costs and helping to ease the cost of living. In the long term, the repeal of the Corn Laws marked a turning point in the British economic policy, moving towards free trade and the industrial economy that would drive Britain's growth throughout the 19th century. Just like the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs, the Corn Laws are remembered today as a classic example of how tariffs intended to protect an economy can sometimes end up causing more harm than good, especially when they're used to defend narrow interests at the expense of the broader population. Another way that tariffs can impact the domestic market is by raising prices in the upstream industries of the goods being subject to tariffs. Let me explain. Let's say that again you are an American that owns a factory that produces toasters. But this time, instead of you struggling, it is the American steel industry that is struggling against Chinese steel. Because again, the Chinese steel is cheaper to import. You naturally use Chinese steel to make your toasters because it makes the most economic sense, and so that you can make your toasters cheap enough to be competitive against other toaster companies. But then a politician like Trump gets into office and slaps a tariff on Chinese steel because he wants to protect American steelworks. What happens to you now? The price of steel rises artificially, meaning your cost to manufacture your toasters is higher, meaning you have to raise the prices of your toasters. And in fact, every other toaster factory that is manufacturing in America has to raise their prices too. And so, in a weird way, a tariff that is meant to protect a certain American industry has the opposite effect on other American industries, increasing the prices on Americans and making those American goods less competitive abroad. Once again on this channel, we can see that trying to artificially mess with the laws of supply and demand always has unintended consequences. This sets up another question. How come the economy grew under Trump during his first term? Now let's jump back to the present, or at least to the recent past, and see how tariffs have played out in modern America under Trump's first term. Back in 2018, Trump rolled out a wave of tariffs targeting everything from steel and aluminum to goods coming in from China. His administration argued that these tariffs would revive American manufacturing, protect American jobs, and, like in the Corn Laws example, reduce dependency on foreign imports. The target was clear: major foreign competitors like China, which had captured a large share of the U.S. market in everything from industrial metals to everyday consumer goods. By placing tariffs on imported Chinese products, the administration intended to make it more costly to buy foreign goods and give American businesses a price advantage. For example, a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum were imposed, which raised the cost of imported metals for American businesses that relied on them, just like in our toaster example. So, what happened in the end? Well, it was a mixed bag. The tariffs did, in some cases, give a temporary boost to certain U.S. industries, especially those in metals production. But the costs quickly spread across the economy in unexpected ways. For instance, companies that needed steel and aluminum for production, such as car and toaster manufacturers, suddenly had to pay higher prices for their raw materials. These companies then passed the extra costs on to the consumer, as was the natural reaction, and this led to rising prices on a range of goods from cars to cans of beer. In fact, studies found that American consumers and businesses bore the brunt of these tariff costs, which were likely worth billions in added expenses. However, despite these added costs, the economy was doing great under Trump's first term. How come? It turns out that other factors offset the negatives of tariffs. For one, Trump's administration introduced major tax cuts, including significant reductions in corporate tax rates, which spurred investment and business expansion across the U.S. In addition, deregulation efforts made it easier for businesses to operate, encouraging growth and driving job creation. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve maintained a relatively low interest rate environment, which made borrowing cheaper and fueled consumer spending. All of these factors contributed to a booming economy and low unemployment. So while the tariffs created new problems and added costs for businesses, they were basically balanced out by other pro growth policies. The result was an economy that continued to grow, but not necessarily because of the tariffs. Rather, the tariffs' negative impacts were masked by other policies and stimulated economic activity. When you add all these factors together, despite the tariffs imposed by Trump, doing business under his administration was actually way easier than it was before, causing the economy to grow. But as with most tariffs, the story didn't end there. In response to the 2018 tariffs, China and other countries hit back with retaliatory tariffs, targeting American products like soybeans, pork, and whiskey. This locked out the U.S. farmers and exporters out of international markets they depended on. To cushion the blow, the U.S. government had to step in with billions in subsidies to support affected industries, particularly in agriculture. But these subsidies were largely taken out of the pool of money that the tariffs themselves raised. The tariffs raised a little under $100 billion during Trump's term and continue to raise more money during the Biden Harris administration, which is significant even though it isn't astronomical compared to the overall U.S. budget. And this brings us to some ideas that Trump has floated around, including passing even more and more severe tariffs during his second term in order to raise more money for the federal government, and then locking into even more tax cuts or even abolishing the federal income tax entirely. Economists cannot predict the future, and if they do, they are often wrong. As we'll see, history provides plenty of clues, but the final outcome, as always, is yet to be written. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, because 99.2% of you watching aren't subscribed. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and I hope I'll see you in the next one.